This marriage counselor ended a failing marriage for her own selfish desires. But what happens when the one meant to save your marriage becomes the reason it falls apart? This story will leave you speechless. Guys, grab your popcorn because what you're about to see in this captivating movie will amaze you. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're discussing an engaging new Nigerian movie that offers more than just entertainment. It's packed with valuable lessons you won't want to miss. So, let's get into it. The movie begins with a woman named Isabella who returns home one evening only to find the entire house in a mess. Frustrated, she heads straight to her husband, Edward, and starts yelling at him. Edward, who is in the middle of an important business call, tries to calm her down, but Isabella shuts him down and walks away. Later that night, Isabella speaks on the phone with her sister, who will be visiting soon. As she talks, she begins cleaning up the messy house. The next morning, Edward meets his colleague, Ben, at a construction site. Ben informs him that their client has made a decision due to their mistakes, which will result in a significant financial loss. Edward is visibly frustrated as he processes the unfortunate news. That same day, a marriage counselor named Camilla is on a phone call discussing an important matter. She invites her contacts to schedule an interview with her before ending the call. Later that evening, Isabella receives a work-related phone call that leaves her angry. Meanwhile, Edward comes home and finds that his dinner has not been served. After searching around, he wakes Isabella from her sleep, asking her to prepare his meal. She refuses, insisting that he either fix something himself or heat food from the fridge. She then goes back to sleep. Left with no choice, Edward quietly walks to the kitchen and prepares his own meal. The next morning, Isabella wakes up and finds the kitchen in a complete mess. Before confronting Edward about it, she rushes to open the door and finds her sister, Eve, who has just arrived. They exchange pleasantries and enjoy their time together. Later that day, Edward receives a call from Ben confirming that they have lost the contract, leaving him devastated. Shortly after, Isabella returns from work, and Eve, sensing the tension, tries to find out if everything is okay. However, Isabella storms off to confront Edward. Their argument quickly escalates as they yell at each other. Furious, Isabella declares that she will no longer cook for Edward, stating that she is the one shouldering the household expenses. Offended by her words, Edward storms into the kitchen and throws all the food onto the floor. They hurl insults at each other while Eve watches in shock, wondering what the real issue is. Later, Eve approaches Isabella, urging her to talk things through with Edward. But Isabella refuses, insisting she is done with the marriage. She then storms off. Meanwhile, Edward is on a phone call when he notices his wife leaving the house in an outfit he finds inappropriate, but he continues his call without confronting her. That evening, Edward, now fuming with anger, questions Isabella about where she has been and why she is dressed that way. When she refuses to answer, he instructs her to sleep in the living room instead of their bedroom until she reveals her whereabouts. Eve, witnessing the tension, offers Isabella her room, but Isabella insists she will sleep in her own space and leaves. That night, chaos fills the house. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. Why do some men become inconsiderate? And why do some women speak disrespectfully to their husbands when they are financially struggling? What do you think so far? Share your thoughts, and let's see how this unfolds. From that moment on, Isabella and Edward became like enemies, constantly at odds with each other. One day, while enjoying some leisure time, Eve comes across an advertisement on TV about a marriage counselor who has successfully helped couples restore their relationships. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, she quickly notes down the email address and website. Shortly after, Isabella arrives home and Eve welcomes her warmly. She serves food at the dining table, setting a plate for Edward as well. However, at the table, Edward and Isabella act like rivals, treating each other with hostility. That night, Eve calls their mother and explains the ongoing issues between Isabella and Edward, mentioning how much they seem to despise each other. While they are still on the call, another heated argument erupts between Isabella and Edward right at the dining table, with Eve witnessing the intensity firsthand. That same day, Eve sits down with Isabella to discuss her marriage, urging her to consider reconciliation. However, Isabella is unwilling to make it work, even when Eve suggests seeking help from the marriage counselor. Instead, Isabella insists on filing for divorce, saying she is too exhausted to continue. Disheartened, Eve goes to her room and updates their mother on the situation. Their mother insists on calling Isabella herself. However, she also encourages Eve to speak with Edward, hoping that he might be open to working things out. Eve promises to talk to him about it. Isabella received a call from her mother regarding what Eve had told her. Her mother advised her to see a marriage counselor, reminding her that marriage isn't always about good times. There will be challenges too. After some thought, Isabella agreed. Later that evening, Eve approached Edward, who was watching a football match, to discuss his marriage and possible ways to resolve the issues between him and Isabella. However, Edward refused to listen and instead complained even more. Frustrated, he ended the conversation and continued watching his game. The next evening, Isabella's mother called Edward just as he arrived home from work. She spoke to him about seeing the marriage counselor and working things out with Isabella before ending the call. Afterward, Edward warned Eve never to discuss his family matters with anyone else to avoid complications. However, he eventually agreed to see the marriage counselor. On the scheduled day, Isabella and Edward went to meet with the marriage counselor. When she asked them both a question, neither of them responded. Seeing their resistance, the counselor decided to have separate sessions with each of them. Now, is this really a good idea? If you were in their shoes, how would you handle the situation? Would you opt for divorce, or would you try to work things out? Share your thoughts as we continue to see how these sessions unfold. That night, for the first time in a while, Isabella and Edward didn't yell at each other. They simply went to bed, though in separate spaces. The next day, Isabella met with Camilla, the marriage counselor, who asked her several questions about her marriage. When Camilla asked what she disliked most about her husband, Isabella finally opened up, pouring out all her long-standing frustrations. She tried to control herself to avoid exaggerating, but her emotions were evident. When it was Edward's turn, he had to take an urgent phone call first, speaking at the top of his voice before quickly apologizing. Camilla then asked him the same question she had asked Isabella. Edward expressed his frustrations about his wife's behavior and the way she spoke to him. Camilla then tried to get him to imagine the kind of wife he truly desired, but it was difficult for him because he admitted that he no longer thought of Isabella in that way. Later that day, Edward came home looking exhausted. He had a discussion with Ben about work, and Ben assured him that they would do their best this time since they had secured a new client. Afterward, Ben left. That night, Edward woke up in the middle of the night, lost in thought, while Isabella remained fast asleep. The next morning, Edward shared with Ben how his mother-in-law had pressured him and Isabella into seeing a marriage counselor. To him, it felt like a nightmare. However, Ben encouraged him to go through with it if there was still a chance to make things work. They then continued discussing business. That same day, at the counselor's office, another argument broke out between Isabella and Edward. This time, Isabella started it by calling Edward names. As the tension escalated, Camilla had to intervene, calling them both to order. She then asked if they had shared any romantic moments recently. However, they barely responded to that question and instead continued yelling at each other, focusing only on their grievances. When they got home that evening, the argument continued. Eventually, they both agreed to go their separate ways. The following morning, Eve, who had been observing everything, called her mother to update her on the situation. She admitted that she didn't know what to do anymore, but her mother encouraged her to stay strong. After the call, Eve proceeded to make breakfast. Meanwhile, Edward had a private session with Camilla, during which he admitted that he and Isabella had decided to get a divorce. He also asked Camilla not to try stopping him. Camilla reassured him that her role wasn't to force anything, but to provide guidance. She then suggested taking him somewhere for a deeper conversation, and Edward agreed. Surprisingly, Camilla took him to her house, which caught Edward off guard. She explained that she had something special to share with him and invited him to have dinner with her. Edward agreed. As they dined, Camilla shared her experience of seeing many men fall apart due to failed marriages. She told Edward that because she saw potential in him, she wanted to do this to understand how he truly felt. Camilla wasn't married herself, but she continued engaging Edward in conversation, which got him to open up more than he had in a long time. Later that night, Camilla called Edward to check on him. He expressed his gratitude for what she had done, saying that the entire experience had felt like therapy to him. He even complimented the setting. Camilla, pleased with the outcome, looked forward to their next session and ended the call. She was visibly happy about the progress. But let's pause for a moment. Is Camilla really the marriage counselor she claims to be? And is she handling this situation the right way? Let's find out together. The next morning, at the counselor's office, Isabella finally expressed how hurt she was. She admitted that marriage had turned out to be nothing like she had expected, and she had made up her mind to leave. She told Camilla that she no longer loved Edward, but she wasn't leaving him for another woman. She simply wanted out because she was tired. Camilla did not try to stop her. That day, when Isabella got home, she made a phone call to secure an apartment where she would stay in the meantime. Afterward, she informed Edward that she was leaving and that their mother shouldn't be told. She officially ended things with him and told him that her lawyer would contact him. Then she left. The next day, at the marriage counselor's office, Edward was having a good time with Camilla. He opened up to her about the current state of his marriage, and Camilla advised him that if someone had to leave, it should be him rather than Isabella. As the conversation continued, time passed quickly. Meanwhile, Isabella informed Eve that she would be moving out the next day because her marriage had officially ended. Eve, however, did not support this decision. She realized that her plans to help them reconcile were failing. After Isabella warned her not to tell their mother about this, Eve urged her to reconsider. She told Isabella that she and Edward should act like adults and talk things out because the issues between them could still be resolved. However, Isabella refused to listen, and Eve left. Later that night, while Edward was at Camilla's place, he told her that he had no choice but to move on with his life. He explained that Isabella had been set on getting a divorce for a long time, and now he had accepted it. He also expressed how happy he had been recently. Camilla then asked him to stay over, assuring him that she wasn't forcing him to. After some hesitation, Edward agreed. Camilla then went to her room, where she quietly celebrated to herself. She was pleased that Edward was beginning to listen to her. The next morning, Edward arrived home only to find Ben waiting at his door, explaining that he had been trying to reach him. Edward then told Ben that he had spent the night at a friend's place and would be moving out due to the current situation with his wife. As Ben pressed for more details about this friend, Edward avoided the conversation and quickly went inside to pack his things. Before leaving, he informed Isabella about his departure. Eve pleaded with him to give marriage counseling another chance, but since things were going well for him, he ignored her plea. He simply told her to take care of herself and left. Edward then went to Camilla's house that morning. After he explained why he had lodged in a hotel the night before, Camilla subtly hinted that she hoped he would eventually bring his things and stay with her. However, she welcomed him warmly and they enjoyed their time together. Wow! Are you all seeing what's going on here? I must say, I'm as shocked as you are. But let's take a moment to reflect. Why would a marriage counselor be so comfortable allowing a married man to move in with her? And do you think Isabella made the right decision by walking out of her marriage? Let's discuss. The next day, Isabella went to see Camilla to thank her for trying to help make her marriage work. This was their final session, and although Isabella was at peace with everything, Camilla was visibly pleased. After expressing her gratitude, Isabella left. As the saying goes, one man's food is another man's poison. Weeks later, Isabella couldn't understand why she had been having sleepless nights. She confided in Eve, who was surprised to hear this. After a brief conversation, they both went back to bed. Meanwhile, one morning while Camilla was preparing breakfast, Edward walked into the kitchen and asked her why she hadn't accepted any marriage proposals from other men. He remarked that she had everything a man would want in a woman. Camilla didn't respond immediately, and instead, they both expressed how much they enjoyed each other's company. Suddenly, a call came through on Camilla's phone, but she quickly hid it. That same day, Isabella was feeling extremely irritated, but didn't know why. When Eve suggested that she call Edward, believing it might help resolve things, Isabella angrily warned her never to mention his name again and continued in her frustration. A few days later, Isabella invited Ben over to have a conversation. She took the opportunity to ask about Edward's well-being, and Ben mentioned that Edward had been staying in hotels. Isabella was deeply concerned upon hearing this. She then apologized to Ben for cutting him off, explaining that although she and Edward were no longer together, she still wanted to remain friends with him as they had always been. On a particular day, Edward and Camilla were spending time together in her office, with Camilla sitting on his lap. To their surprise, Isabella suddenly walked in. She was just as shocked as they were. Realizing why Camilla hadn't been answering her calls, Isabella turned and walked away. When Isabella got home that day, she was in emotional pain and confided in Eve about what she had just witnessed. Eve found it hard to believe, but she knew Isabella was telling the truth. Wow. Let's be honest. What should Isabella do next if you were in her shoes? Later that evening, Edward and Camilla arrived home. Edward asked Camilla why Isabella had come to see her since their sessions had already ended. Camilla noticed a shift in Edward's mood. Sensing something was off, she asked him if he was missing Isabella. He denied it, but his expression suggested otherwise. Edward then asked for some time to think, and Camilla left for her room. That night, she couldn't sleep. She was lost in thought, realizing that something was beginning to change. The next day, at the construction site, Edward confided in Ben about what had been happening between him and the marriage counselor. Ben suspected that Camilla had manipulated them just to get close to Edward. However, Edward insisted that he wasn't a child and hadn't been manipulated. He was with her because he chose to be. Ben then revealed that Isabella still loved Edward, as she had been calling him just to check on how Edward was doing. Edward found this hard to believe. Ben advised him to take a break and think about what he truly wanted. Edward agreed, and they continued their work. That evening, Edward went to see Camilla. He explained that he needed space because seeing Isabella had affected his thoughts. Although he made it clear that he wasn't going back to her, he wanted time to process everything. Camilla agreed, but then confessed her feelings for him. She reminded him of the risks she had taken to be with him and how much effort she had put in. She warned him about the consequences she would face if people found out about their relationship. Holding him tightly, she pleaded with him not to throw it all away. As the moment grew intense, Edward was caught between emotions. That night, Isabella lay in her bed, reminiscing about the beautiful moments she and Edward had shared over the years. It all felt like a love story that was never supposed to end. One day, Isabella and Eve went to see Camilla. Eve, furious, confronted Camilla, expressing her anger and even threatening to expose her on social media, which could ruin her career and license. Isabella also confronted her, saying she had no right to do what she did to Edward. However, Camilla laughed and reminded Isabella of how she had spoken negatively about her husband and was eager to leave him. Now, suddenly, she wanted him back. Indeed, Isabella missed Edward, but she wasn't willing to be with a man who wasn't ready to fight for their marriage. After the confrontation, she and Eve left. That day, Camilla canceled all her appointments, went home, and broke down in tears. She realized that, once again, she was alone. No man wanted to stay with her in the long run, and the pain of her loneliness consumed her. When Isabella and Eve got home, Isabella advised Eve not to stop recommending marriage counselors to people because there were still good ones out there. Isabella also admitted that she had always known what to do to save her marriage, but had ignored it. Now, she felt it was too late. Eve sympathized with her, and they both went inside. To Isabella's surprise, Edward was there waiting for her. He told her that no place felt like home. Isabella then asked if he was truly ready to put in the effort to make their marriage work. Without hesitation, Edward said he was. They expressed their love for each other, reconciled, and let go of the past. They embraced and enjoyed the moment together, while Eve, in the background, rejoiced with excitement. This story teaches us that those who truly want to be with you will stay, no matter what happens. On the other hand, those who don't want to be with you will leave, no matter how hard you try to hold on. It reminds us that we must take responsibility for our actions. For love and marriage to work, both partners must be willing to make sacrifices. Marriage is a beautiful thing, but to get the best out of it, we must be ready to do what it takes to maintain it. Also, be careful about who you share your problems with. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more exciting updates on the latest Nigerian movies. See you next time.